The first thing the neighbor noticed was the smell, sharp and wrong, cutting through the clean bite of winter air like a warning no one wanted to understand. On the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, where porch lights usually meant safety and routine, Daniel Harper's house sat dark except for a single glow in the kitchen window. Daniel was the kind of man people described with simple words that carried real weight: dependable, steady, present. He owned a small contracting business that kept him busy year-round, fixing roofs after storms, repairing broken fences, restoring kitchens for young couples who couldn't afford a full remodel. His days started before sunrise, coffee in a travel mug, work boots thudding softly against the hallway floor so he wouldn't wake the kids. He was a father first, always. 2 children who still ran to the door when they heard his truck, and a life built on doing what he promised, even when it meant going without. That winter had been especially cold. The kind of cold that made car doors stick and turned the breath in your lungs into a painful reminder that the world didn't care how hard you worked. Still, Daniel kept showing up. He had invoices to send, calls to return, and a mortgage that didn't pause for weather. That night, the temperature dropped fast after dusk. A thin crust of ice formed along the gutters and the steps leading up to Daniel's front door. Inside, the heat was on, the house smelling faintly of detergent and something warm from dinner, small signs of a home that had been lived in properly. But the hours passed, and Daniel didn't come inside. At first, it didn't register as danger, just inconvenience. Maybe he was unloading tools. Maybe he'd gotten stuck on a call. Maybe his phone battery had died. Ordinary explanations, the kind people cling to because the alternative is too heavy to hold. Then a neighbor's dog began barking. Not its usual bored yapping, this was frantic, sharp, relentless. A curtain shifted across the street. Another porch light came on. Someone opened a door, called out a name, then shut it again quickly, as if the cold could swallow sound. A figure crossed the street, hands shoved deep into pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. The neighbor moved carefully, eyes scanning the driveway, the front steps, the shadows near the garage. And that's when he saw him, Daniel, lying near the side of the house, half in the dark, half in the spill of light from a motion sensor that flickered like it couldn't decide whether to reveal the truth. The neighbor froze. Even from a distance, it was clear this wasn't an accident. Daniel's body was positioned wrong, too still, too final. And the surface around him looked strange, wet in places where ice should have formed, streaked as if something had been poured and had refused to freeze the way water would. The neighbor didn't touch anything. Instinct, or maybe fear, kept him back. He fumbled for his phone with clumsy fingers and called emergency services, his voice thinner than he expected. Within minutes, blue lights pulsed against the snow-dusted lawns. Officers moved in tight, cautious steps, flashlights cutting across the ground. One of them stopped short, staring at the scene, then looked away quickly, professional discipline battling plain human shock. A medic knelt briefly, then stood. A small motion of the head told the story no one wanted confirmed. Detectives arrived as the night deepened, their breath visible in short bursts. The first notes were immediate and unsettling. Daniel had been shot from close range, and harsh chemicals had been used, enough to sting the eyes even in open air. It wasn't random. It wasn't rushed. It was staged. And whoever did it had wanted time for evidence to fade, for the cold to confuse the timeline, for Daniel Harper to become a question instead of a person. But questions have a way of turning into answers when someone has planned too much, and left too many footprints behind. By morning, the cul-de-sac no longer belonged to the people who lived there. Police tape cut across driveways, officers stood shoulder to shoulder against the cold, and the quiet street felt exposed, like a private life turned inside out. Detectives worked slowly, deliberately. The chemicals poured over Daniel's body had done damage, burning fabric, distorting surfaces, blurring details, but not enough to erase intent. The gunshot had been delivered at close range. There were no signs of a struggle inside the house, no forced entry, no ransacking. Whatever had happened, it had drawn Daniel outside willingly. That detail lingered. Inside the home, everything was painfully ordinary. Children's shoes by the door. A half-folded load of laundry. A calendar on the fridge marked with school pickups and work deadlines. The life of a man who had planned to come back inside. Detectives canvassed neighbors, replaying the night in fragments. A dog barking. A figure walking past the house around 9:40 p.m. Headlamp light bobbing briefly near the side yard. Another neighbor mentioned a car idling farther down the street for hours, its engine cutting in and out, as if the driver were trying not to be noticed. That detail shifted the tone of the investigation. This wasn't impulsive. It was patient. While forensic teams processed the scene, another group began digging into Daniel's past. Finances were clean. No debts worth mentioning. No disputes with clients that rose above the level of ordinary complaints. He wasn't involved in anything illegal. He wasn't hiding a second life. But when detectives reached back several years, they found something small, and easily overlooked. Before Daniel had settled into family life, before the routines and responsibilities, he'd briefly used a dating app. There were a handful of messages exchanged with different women, most leading nowhere. One conversation, though, stood out, not because it was dramatic, but because it ended abruptly. A few polite exchanges. A short meeting for coffee. No second date. The woman's name was Emily Carter. At first, it didn't seem relevant. The encounter had happened years earlier. There were no heated messages, no threats, no ongoing contact. Daniel hadn't spoken about her to anyone. By all accounts, he barely remembered her. Emily, however, had remembered him. By the time detectives located her, Emily was no longer living the quiet life Daniel had chosen. She was involved with a man named Mark Reynolds, a man with a reputation that followed him like a shadow. Prior convictions. A history of control and volatility. Someone who didn't take rejection lightly, whether it was personal or imagined. Friends later told investigators that Emily often rewrote her past in ways that gained sympathy or protection. When she spoke about Daniel to Mark, the story wasn't brief or neutral. It was darker. She claimed Daniel had mistreated her, humiliated her, left her feeling powerless. Details shifted depending on the listener, but the emotional tone remained the same. And Mark listened. At first, it was just talk, late-night conversations fueled by resentment and jealousy. But over time, the name Daniel Harper became something else. A symbol. A target. Someone Mark began to blame for feelings that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. That was the beginning of the obsession. Detectives would later uncover messages between Emily and Mark that showed the slow transformation, from anger, to fixation, to planning. It didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over months, quietly, while Daniel lived his life unaware that he had become the centerpiece of someone else's story. A story that was no longer about the past. It was about punishment. What began as conversation slowly hardened into intention. Emily and Mark didn't talk about Daniel every day, but when they did, the tone shifted. Emily would bring him up casually at first, an offhand comment, a name dropped during an argument, a story retold with slightly sharper edges each time. Mark absorbed it all, filing away details like ammunition. Where Daniel lived. What kind of work he did. The fact that he had children. The fact that he seemed happy. That last part mattered more than either of them admitted. Mark was not a man who tolerated perceived disrespect. Control was his language, and violence had always been his punctuation. As weeks turned into months, his curiosity became something darker. He wanted to see Daniel. To know his routine. To understand how someone who, in Mark's mind, had caused harm, could move on untouched. Emily helped. She began researching Daniel's life quietly, carefully. social media accounts, business listings, reviews left by grateful customers. She learned what time he left for work, when his truck returned, how often the house lights went dark by a certain hour. She looked up the address, studied satellite images of the street, memorized where cars parked and where shadows pooled at night. Her online searches changed too. Questions about legal responsibility. About shared guilt. About how evidence is traced. How vehicles are linked to crimes. She didn't search once or twice, she searched repeatedly, refining the language, trying different phrases, as if looking for reassurance hidden between the lines. Mark took on the rest. He acquired what he needed in pieces, never all at once. A weapon sourced through contacts who didn't ask questions. Harsh industrial chemicals obtained under the pretense of cleaning work. Disposable clothing that made him look like just another late-night laborer. Even cloned plates, matched carefully to avoid immediate suspicion. Together, they rehearsed the idea without ever saying it plainly. There was no dramatic declaration, no moment where one turned to the other and said, "We're going to do this." Instead, it was understood. Accepted. Encouraged by silence as much as by words. Mark began driving past Daniel Street at night. At first, he stayed far back, watching from the corner, timing the neighborhood's rhythms. Which lights stayed on late? Which houses were empty? When the street settled into stillness. He learned patience there, sitting in the dark with the engine off, breath slow, thoughts loud. Emily wasn't present for the surveillance, but she was always involved. She wanted updates. Confirmation. Proof that Daniel was still there, still living the life she had described as undeserved. Each update tightened the bond between them, turning shared resentment into shared purpose. By the time winter arrived in full force, the plan no longer felt abstract. It had shape. Sequence. A chosen night. They agreed on the approach. Mark would look harmless. A worker. Someone with a reason to be outside after dark. A head torch would explain the light. A knock, a request, something to bring Daniel out without raising alarm. It would be quick, Mark insisted. Controlled. Emily didn't argue. On the day it was meant to happen, Mark left early, telling no one where he was going. He parked far enough away to avoid cameras, then walked the rest of the distance, boots crunching softly over frost. He waited for hours, watching Daniel's house, feeling the cold seep through layers of clothing until it no longer mattered. Inside, Daniel finished his evening unaware that someone was studying the exact moment his front door would open. The plan was no longer a thought experiment. It was counting down. The night closed in early, darkness settling over the street like a held breath. Mark waited. From his position, he could see the soft glow of Daniel's kitchen window, the faint movement of a man finishing the day's last routines. Mark checked his watch again and again, time stretching, fingers stiff inside his gloves. The cold no longer felt sharp, it felt distant, like his body had decided this moment mattered more than discomfort. When the light inside dimmed, Mark stood. He switched on the head torch, its beam controlled and narrow, and walked toward the house with practiced calm. Anyone watching would have seen nothing alarming, just a worker, maybe responding to a late call, boots steady, posture unhurried. He knocked. Inside, Daniel hesitated. It was late, but not impossibly so. The light outside suggested someone official or practical. A problem, maybe. A neighbor needing help. Daniel grabbed a jacket and stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him to keep the cold from rushing inside. The conversation was brief. Quiet. Whatever was said didn't carry far enough for anyone else to hear. Then it ended. The sound that followed was not loud enough to echo through the street, but it was final. Daniel fell where he stood, the frost beneath him darkening as heat met ice. Mark stood over him for a moment, breathing hard, scanning the street, listening for movement that never came. He wasn't finished. From a container he had prepared earlier, Mark poured chemicals over the still form, the sharp smell cutting through the cold air. It burned his nose, his eyes, but he forced himself to continue. This was part of it. All of it. Then he was gone. Mark retraced his steps quickly, head down, torch off now. He reached the car parked far away and drove without headlights until he turned onto a larger road. Every movement was calculated. Every second accounted for. Later that night, miles from the quiet street, flames rose briefly in an empty area as the vehicle burned. By morning, there would be little left to examine. While Daniel's neighborhood filled with flashing lights and shock, Mark crossed borders with Emily at his side. They checked into hotels, shared meals, took photos that made them look carefree, two people untouched by the chaos they had created. But distance didn't dissolve evidence. Back home, detectives worked through the night and into the next day. CCTV footage began to form a path, unfamiliar plates passing through tolls, a vehicle stopping too long in the wrong place. Phone data placed Mark near the house for hours. Emily's searches painted a picture she could not erase. Piece by piece, the story assembled itself. When officers finally knocked on their door, months of careful planning collapsed in seconds. Mark was calm. Emily was defiant. Both insisted the truth would never fully surface. They were wrong. Because while they believed they had erased a man, they had left behind something far more durable, a trail built from obsession, patience, and the certainty that no crime stays buried forever. The arrests came quietly, without drama or spectacle. Mark was taken first. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. When officers explained the charges, he nodded as if confirming something he had already accepted. In the interview room, under harsh lights that stripped away bravado, he admitted to pulling the trigger. But his words were careful, measured. He spoke of impulse. Of emotion. Of being pushed too far by a story that had lived in his head for years. He never called it a plan. Emily told a different story. She denied everything beyond knowing Daniel's name. Denied research. Denied encouragement. Denied involvement. She presented herself as a bystander caught in the wake of a man's choices. Her voice shook at the right moments. Her pauses felt rehearsed. Investigators didn't argue. They didn't need to. They laid out the timeline instead. Search histories that stretched back months. Messages that revealed fixation and validation. Location data that placed her at key moments of planning. Records showing she had helped select dates, refine details, and calm Mark's doubts when hesitation surfaced. The trial drew intense attention. Daniel's name filled headlines, not as a statistic, but as a person, a father, a business owner, a presence suddenly missing. His children sat with family members, too young to understand why so many strangers whispered when they entered the courtroom. Prosecutors spoke slowly, deliberately. They described the patience required to wait outside a home for hours. The precision of the approach. The return to the scene to pour chemicals, not out of panic, but purpose. They emphasized that this was not rage, it was resolve. Mark's defense leaned on admission without ownership. Yes, he acted. But he claimed he was driven, manipulated, consumed by emotion. Emily's defense insisted on distance, arguing that words were not actions, that curiosity was not intent. The jury disagreed. They saw planning where the defense saw coincidence. Cooperation where denial claimed separation. They understood that some crimes are built long before the final moment, constructed through shared belief and sustained obsession. When the verdicts were read, the room was silent. Guilty. Life sentences followed. No chance of early release. No room for reinterpretation. Mark stared straight ahead. Emily finally cried, not from remorse, but from the collapse of the future she had believed she could outpace. Daniel's family did not celebrate. There was no relief strong enough to outweigh absence. Justice, they learned, does not bring people back. It only stops the damage from continuing. The house was eventually sold. Fresh paint covered the walls, and new families walked through the rooms, unaware of the echoes that lingered beneath the quiet. The street returned to routine, trash bins at the curb, children riding bikes, porch lights clicking on at dusk. From the outside, it looked like the past had been neatly packed away. For Daniel's children, time moved differently. They grew up measuring years by absence. Birthdays marked by an empty chair. School events where other kids scanned the crowd for familiar faces while they already knew who would not be there. Their memories of their father became treasures, his laugh, the smell of sawdust on his jacket, the way he always said goodnight no matter how tired he was. They learned his story in fragments as they got older. Not the details the public consumed, but the truth that mattered, that he was chosen not for what he did wrong, but because someone else refused to let go of a version of the past that never existed. In prison, Mark and Emily were separated by concrete and consequence. Appeals were filed and denied. Arguments hardened into bitterness. The shared purpose that once bound them dissolved into blame. Their world narrowed to routines and regrets, neither willing to fully claim responsibility, both unable to escape it. Detectives moved on to other cases, but Daniel's file remained intact, evidence neatly catalogued, timelines precise. It became a reminder used in training, a lesson in how obsession escalates when left unchecked, how planning disguises itself as justification. For the community, the shock faded, but the memory did not. People locked doors more carefully. They questioned unfamiliar faces longer. They learned that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly, it sometimes waits patiently, dressed as something ordinary. And Daniel Harper became more than the way he died. He became the story of a life interrupted by someone else's obsession. A reminder that cruelty can be methodical, that harm can be rehearsed, and that justice, while necessary, is never enough to repair what is taken. On cold winter nights, when frost settles quietly and streets fall still, there are moments when the silence feels heavier than it should. That is where Daniel remains, not in the details of the crime, but in the quiet space where a good man should have grown old.